My name's Paul Hill. And immediately have problems with video. There we go. My name's Paul Hill. I'm a Senior Development Manager at BazaarVoice. Eric and I today will be presenting today on BazaarVoice and Kanban Enterprise Scaling. How many folks have seen these gongs before? Okay, so BazaarVoice, initially when we had these, we used them to celebrate our sales achievements. We'd have a sale and a deal close, and we'd ring the gong, and if you've ever heard them, they're extremely loud. And we got to a point where they were going off just constantly. So we decided to get rid of the local gongs in the area, sales area, and go with company-wide gongs for our common areas. And they're really loud, so they call us together for celebrations, for discussions on good things and bad things, whether it's quarterly results or just celebrations around, hey, we closed a really big deal, or whether it's an R&D achievement like launching Kanban method with one of our teams or something like that. So it's very Austinite-ish of us. If you've ever been to Austin, Texas, you know we're kind of a fairly laid-back town, lots of music, lots of different sorts of people, keep Austin weird kind of thing. So BazaarVoice started in 2005. It means voice of the market, so the whole bazaar is not bizarre as in B-I, it's actually B-A. And we started off doing ratings and reviews, so if you've ever gone to Best Buy's website or Home Depot, we are the system behind the reviews and the ratings that they have there. If you ask a question, you get an answer from some sort of brand, like Sony or Samsung or something like that. We provide that service to them, so very white label. We are actually, a lot of people won't know this, in fact most people won't know this, we're actually, the last time we looked, we were the third largest internet traffic company out there, meaning creating internet traffic, so we're behind Facebook and Google. But you're not going to see us out there anywhere because we're behind everybody. So we're the combination of all the different retailers, very large retailers and brands out there. We pride ourselves on authentication. We have over 300 moderators around the world where they focus on making sure that the reviews and the ratings that are exposed and shown on these different sites are valid. They come from real people, that they're related to the product that they're reviewing. And it's very important to us. So this authentic reviews is kind of core to our beliefs at BV. This CGC, this is consumer-generated content. So as we've matured, you know, we went from ratings and reviews, then we added these questions and answers sort of thing. And then we have this, now we have this something called curations where, you know, we're curating content, picture content from different sources, but again, ensuring that they're authentic. So we are trying to strive to be the authentic provider of these consumer-generated content throughout the world. So this is very common at BV. So the hard liquor at the desk, I would be surprised if you couldn't find hundreds of bottles of different sorts of liquor. And the Kanban book here, you know, it's very laid back, easygoing sort of atmosphere. If you drink, it's there. If you don't, no big deal. The culture or the values at BV are around the passion and innovation, being open and generous, respectful, and probably not above all else, but one that's very important is performance. So it doesn't matter what you look like, what you wear, as long as you get your job done and do it well, that's what we care about. So I know a dev manager who's got a mohawk, and he's generally in shorts, t-shirt, and chucks, the kind of shoe, if you don't know what they are. We have another guy who, he BVs out. I mean, it's total BV, so green, and his toenails are green. So he paints his toenails and shows up on Fridays in his BV outfit, which happens to include green toenails. People are first, roles are second. So you probably hear all these things all the time, right? Everybody talks about their values and how they're unique and they're followed. And it's like, I'll just say it from my perspective. I've been there a year and a half. And it's probably the first place in 15 years since I got out of the military that truly, they really follow their values and believe in them and celebrate them on a regular basis. So as you can probably guess, those kinds of values engender a unique culture. Dan here, if you know anything about the JavaScript world, Dan used to be on the board of jQuery. He's now a dev manager for for our display team. And it doesn't really matter whether you want to hang out on the couch code or you want to hang out with your bears or lay out on your car. So I actually don't know when these were taken. They just happened to show up, and as I was preparing for this presentation, I just started snapping pictures of what's unique about BV, what's kind of different, but also somewhat related to our talk here. That uniqueness leads to some chaos. So if we experiment and we have 28 teams creating experiments and innovating, what that ends up being is a 28 teams solving the same problem 28 different ways, which that can lead to all kinds of interesting problems. I mean, we've spent the last sort of 2 to 3 years going through this replatforming effort of like, hey, if we're going to scale, we can't really, copy a set of reviews from one machine to another machine and then expose it to another customer, because that's the way we do it. It's like, how about some sort of database that actually has that and can expose it to the users instead. So it was extremely, when I first came to BV, it was very, very crazy. In fact, I actually started 2 weeks before I started. The tech lead on the display team started Skyping me and emailing me 2 weeks prior to my start date, just to kind of set up expectations around the craziness that's there. We had over 250 open customer client issues and almost 1,000 just general issues in our Jira backlog. About three and a half months in, I was invited to what we call operations review meeting. Kelly Evans is one of my BV partners in crime there. He's the other Kanban coach there. Runs that meeting, and I got invited about 15 minutes prior. Really didn't know what this meeting was about. Never been to it before, so I just saw the invite, kind of looked at who was invited, and it's like some support managers, some implementation managers, project managers, so I wasn't too worried about it. So I show up, and it's like the VP of engineering's there, and there's like 6 other VPs, and they're all looking at me. I'm like, okay, I don't know what's going on here. And they're like, their first question out of their mouth is like, Paul, so we got these big deals blocked by your team. Like, okay. It's like, what are you going to do about it? Like, luckily, I had read up a little bit about some issues this morning, and I hoped that that's what they were talking about. But it was definitely I don't know what to answer. We got 3 days or 4 days until the end of the quarter. Maybe it was a week. I don't remember exactly. But it's like, we got to actually get this done so we can get these guys launched so that we can recognize the revenue associated with these customers. So as you can probably hear, it was very chaotic, crazy. It was something that's like, I'm glad I had been in the military for 10 years and had to deal with colonels that always got their way, because I was at least calm under pressure. It's like, let me get back to you. It's like, well, we really need this. Let me get back to you. Let me just make sure we're going to make headway on this. So it was a very crazy time. I asked kind of like, well, how do you know what you're going to work on? It's like, oh, well, we really don't know. We're just going to pull in things because the product manager says we should work on them. And it's just no coherent plan, no coherent execution. Well, I wasn't the only one confused. The VP of engineering had only started about a month before me, and he wanted to know what was the status of all 28 teams. Not just the display team, but I've got 28 engineering teams that are doing something. What are they doing? What's the status of what they're doing? It's like there was no answer. There was no way for him to get the answer. It was like, unless he had 28, or I guess it wasn't 28, but somewhere like 10 to 15 development managers come and give him a briefing on each of the teams, and you can imagine how long that takes. I mean, that's like 7 to 8 hours of meetings to understand, the status of all these teams. So there had to be a better way. Now, one of the questions that came out of this was, what's your dev process? And the answer was, well, we're Scrum. It's like, we did training back in 2011 on Scrum, and we had the whole team do this, so that's what we are. It's like, well, what does that mean? So you had this training, 4 years later, it's like, so tell me about it. Well, what it turned out, though, was that in 2011, or 2012, we went public. We bought this little company. I don't know if I can say their name, Power Reviews. So I said their name. So we bought this little company. They were competing with us, and they were doing a really good job of their thing. Only problem is, about a year later, the DOJ said, hey, you're a monopoly. It's like, you can't do that. And it's like, hey, we're right. Here's all the proof and everything. Well, unfortunately, the DOJ disagreed with us, and we had to divest of Power Reviews. And when all that stuff happening, we lost 60% of our engineering staff. So we got this tech boom in Austin. I don't know if anybody knows about it. We're like hiring 3,500 engineers on average a year. And so it was really easy for companies to start taking our top talent. So we had a lot of competition, a lot of churn going on, and we lost a lot of that tribal knowledge. That knowledge of how we're doing, not just those hidden little gems of how things work, but how we're actually following a process. So Kelly and I got called into a meeting with another VP, and it's like, hey, we need to do some training for our teams. It's like, okay, what kind of training? It's like, well, here's some material that we have that we got from our previous training. It's like, how about look over that and figure out what you can do and go ahead and set up some training with our teams. It's like, well, this is like 5 days of training material. It's like, are we gonna, you're gonna have us go through and present 5 days of training material? Well, at the time, I was a certified Scrum Master. That was it. I mean, I wasn't a trainer or coach or anything like that. So I was trying to figure out how I'm gonna do this training. Who do I train? So I sent out a quick, just a real short, probably take you less than 5 minutes fill out survey of what do you know about Agile? Turns out that over 50% of our R&D staff, that's developers and testers and DevOps, they really didn't have any experience with Agile. It's like they'd heard of Scrum, but they'd not really worked with it. Obviously, waterfall is so common, and definitely no one was talking about Kanban. It wasn't even on my mind at that point. Not until just shortly thereafter, I went to this thing called Keep Austin Agile and saw Eric's presentation on the Kanban method. And then shortly thereafter, I was introduced to him, and we worked together to come up with a plan that I presented to our leadership team in R&D. That was where I ran into my first resistance. There's a director that said, Kanban's easy. Just go look it up on the internet. And there's this blue book. You can read it, and you can implement it. It's like, okay, well, doesn't sound easy to me. It's like, yeah, you can do it. You can do 3 or 4 lunch and learns, spend an hour going over it, train everybody up, and shouldn't be a problem. You can handle this. Well, I definitely wasn't qualified, and I didn't think that an hour of every couple weeks was going to be sufficient to understand how we'd go about doing that, how we would implement something for 200 plus engineers. And those 200 engineers are, they're mostly in Austin, but they're also in New York City and San Francisco and Kiev and Lviv, and so we're dealing with all these different geographical areas, locations as well. So it's definitely not something I felt I was qualified to do. It's like, so I was trying to figure out how to convince this guy, hey, let's spend the money. Let's spend money, bring in a coach or a trainer, and figure out some way to go about this. And he was very much opposed to it. So my secondary idea was, I'm going to try an experiment. So I talked to my boss and the VP, and it's like, hey, how about instead, let's spend less money and bring in this guy, Eric, to implement an experiment and try it out. So with that idea, I had to come up with a team. Which would be the team to do this? So this is just a little bit of context around the Firebird team. Yes, Thunderbird, Firebird, Phoenix. So we're supposed to be rising from the ashes. Our red line here is our commitment. As you can see, it kept going down and down and down. I was trying to become more predictable, and our delivery was still all over the place. So we never really got predictable. We just kept decreasing the amount we were going to commit to. Yeah, these are metal bands here. Those are the names of our sprints. So again, I'm trying to, the culture of BV is fun. It's a unique. So we decided to go with Firebird. Our hypothesis is this small team. One, it's a fairly young team. Meaning that they're new to BV. They've been there less than a year, most of them. We had one that had been there over a year. So they were willing to change without a problem. It's like, yeah, let's try it out. So we thought our hypothesis here is we're going to take a small team, we're going to prove it out, and then as we prove it out, we're going to roll it out to other teams. And that might take 6 months, it might take 9 months, or it may take a year. And it's something something that we thought was worthwhile trying to do. So with that, this is where Eric came in to play and started introducing us to Kanban.
Hey guys, for those that don't know me, my name is Eric Green. I'm the CEO of Process IQ based in Austin. We primarily do lean management technology and training and consulting. So I guess it was about a year ago that I engaged with Paul and Kelly at BazaarVoice the summer of last year. It's safe to say that we had a pretty interesting ride, a pretty fun ride, and I think we've done some really cool things at BazaarVoice. I always like to set some context with this. I think this is an apt quote here. I reference it quite often. If you can't describe what you're doing as a process, you don't know what you're doing. That's something I fundamentally believe. And I think generally we don't actually pay enough attention to having a minimum viable, coherent process that we can leverage to do things in a repeatable way. I think sometimes we can look at something like individuals and interactions over processes and tools, and I think we can take that, we can go a bit overboard with that to a point that where if we do talk about process, then somehow it disqualifies us from being agile. But I do think in order to get our house in order and to do things in a consistent, repeatable way, we do in fact need to do a bit of due diligence to actually define a minimum viable process. And so that's a lot of what we did at BazaarVoice. So the approach to the engagement was really no rocket science, really kind of a two-prong approach of workshops and then follow-up coaching with the teams to ensure that they get what they need, that their questions get answered. But we definitely need to create a feedback loop after the workshop. So the workshops were primarily static-based workshops, and then we had to continue to coach the teams going forward, and through a train-the-trainer model, we actually, through working with Paul and Kelly, we did a kind of a knowledge transfer over a period of time so that they could take a lot of the brunt of coaching the teams coming out of the workshop, and that was an interesting overall experiment that we did on the train-the-trainer, and it actually, I think, worked out to be pretty effective. So another just basic heuristic that I like to reference a lot in working with clients is this idea of we should always be able to identify what problem we're solving with any practice that we do, with any policy that we implement. If the team cannot come together and coherently answer this question of what problem we're solving, then you should probably consider giving up whatever that practice is, regardless of where it comes from. So, solve a problem, and that, I think, is just a really practical heuristic to use to kind of get you headed in the right direction and keep you moving in the right trajectory. So just a quick show of hands, how many folks are familiar with static and have kind of implemented it in practice? Okay, a couple here and there. So static is really a high leverage approach in my experience to gaining low resistance adoption of Kanban practices and ideas in the organization. And so it's something that we heavily leveraged at BazaarVoice and is really the backbone of the workshop that we did with the teams. So we're doing a variety of things here. So static is systems thinking approach to introducing Kanban, and it's really just a pragmatic way to unearth hidden details about how teams work, how they make decisions, how they manage risk, how they manage flow, A lot of that stuff tends to be tacitly understood or generally kind of misunderstood. And so we just take time and just go back to pen and paper and work with the teams to really just list out what are their assumptions about how they work. So one of the main things that we do with static is we establish the starting context that we're working with. Again, going back to the idea of always solve a problem, know what problem you're solving. Well, we first have to identify the problems that need to be solved and use that to guide what we do. So we establish the context of the team and we mold around that. We do archaeology. I like the term archaeology because we unearth a lot of hidden details about how the teams, how they actually function and how they make decisions and how they manage risk. So the archaeology aspect of it always tends to be very enlightening, and I think that was definitely the case with the teams at BazaarVoice. And then you walk out of the static workshop with a minimum viable design for a work management system, a pull system that builds atop all the other exercises. So these static workshops are highly interactive. You're on your feet a lot, and you got to keep that blood flowing to the brain, and it usually turns out good, and I think it did at BazaarVoice. So definitely, I found that fun is a leading indicator of learning. So we definitely want to have a lot of fun doing this stuff, and that was quite easy and natural at BazaarVoice. I've really been impressed with BazaarVoice's culture and the openness and some of the stuff that Paul talked about, with the mohawks and the bow ties. And I'm fairly convinced that Paul also paints his toenails, but he won't admit it. But so we want to have a lot of fun when we're doing this, right? This shouldn't be, a talking head in the room telling you a bunch of theory. We got to get people up and doing things and having fun, and that usually generates a good outcome. So in terms of, establishing that context, establishing what problem needs to be solved, here are just some things that we cherry-picked from one of the exercises, and I mean, these things are pretty telling. But, there's definitely some stuff to go off and fix here. The software sucks. I mean, that's like, bam, that's certainly a dissatisfaction that needs to be addressed. Process gets gamed, pressure, tons of emails. So as we try to provoke a continuous improvement mindset, we sort of have to unearth these problems of what do we need to go off and fix. Chipping away at these dissatisfactions is something that never ends. It's not like you finish the workshop and then all of a sudden magically everything works better the next day. It certainly doesn't work that way. So we're constantly chipping away at these dissatisfactions. Periodically, we should rerun these exercises. I think BazaarVoice has done that periodically to see how things have changed. But we sort of declare war on these dissatisfactions, and then you're just chipping away at them continuously, month over month, and it sort of never stops. But this is, back to the idea of what problem are we solving. This is the very first thing that we do is we establish this context so that we make sure that we're solving real problems and we're not prescribing something that is not needed or that may hurt. Overall, what we're trying to do with Kanban is balance demand against capability. So in order to do that, we need to understand the nature of demand in the first place. This is also something that tends to be quite enlightening in my experience with teams of just taking a look at what are the different types of things that we process, what are the different types of work items we get, what's the arrival rate of each type, what's the cost of delay of each type, where are they coming from, who's receiving the output, how are they being validated. Until we really sit down and write this stuff down, it's all very muddy in my experience. And if you just have a generic story type, and a story can be anything and everything, and there's no taxonomy there, then it becomes very hard to manage and measure what you're doing. So we actually do a demand analysis to really look at what are the different types of things that the team works on, and then how do we make decisions around around scheduling those things, and what's the risk associated with those different types. We really have to understand that. to get to a coherent sort of heuristic or way of making decisions about trade-offs. There always, or not always, but most of the time, there tends to be more demand than the team can service. It's pretty rare, at least in my experience, that a team gets to a point where they actually do, like in Dragos' case, say, we burned off the backlog. I mean, how often does that actually happen? I haven't seen that very much. Interestingly, they actually did that at BazaarVoice. They got to a point and they said, we've burned off the backlog. What else you got? That's just pretty cool and very uncommon. But we need to fundamentally understand the nature of demand if we're going to balance that against our capability. So again, there's no rocket science in any of this stuff. So we do an exercise. We did an exercise with the teams to really just tell us how you solve a problem. So not what the handoffs are, but what is the fundamental workflow from taking the raw material of an idea and progressively refining that option into something that makes money. How do we do that? What are the fundamental steps in doing that? Draw a picture of it on the wall, and let's talk about it. So we do the workflow analysis piece, and we think about exit criteria, so you can lay out stickies, and the pink ones can be approvals or some special significance like that. But we find that this is quite useful just to go in once and just purely talk about and think about how do we solve a problem and draw a picture of it. And then this ultimately will be the backbone of our system design activity that we do at the end. So one of the areas that I, in particular as a coach, like to focus on, and other coaches may not focus as much, is I'm quite keen on policies and specifically doing an exercise around policies. So it's something we certainly did at BazaarVoice with the teams. We find that when we don't have coherent policies and a shared understanding about what those policies are, everything is muddy. Decision making is harder. You have more meetings, you have more emails, and everything is just harder to manage. So we take some time, and with the teams, we looked at how do you design policies around some of these nuggets here. These are kind of ones that I focus on. But how do you qualify and expedite? Can someone send a scary email to you, and does that qualify as an expedite? Or do we look for something a bit more quantitative or even qualitative? Is there customer impact? Is there monetary impact? Is the data incorrect? We should be able to consistently qualify something as an expedite. And it shouldn't be just, you can craft a scary email and then that gets into the system and blocks other work. So we want to get out of that mode and actually have a repeatable way of defining what an expedite actually is so that the team can consistently take that demand. Fixed date is another problem area that I find in my experience. Again, I think a lot of times there can be a tendency to, based on a date preference, again, we craft a scary email and say we really, really, really need it by this date. But, oh, by the way, we haven't thought about the cost of delay, but we just really want it by that date. And so here I think we need to distinguish between date preference and a fixed date cost of delay. It's always useful to ask the requester of what is the cost of delay on that item, and that drives a very useful conversation. But we need to have a consistent way of qualifying something as a fixed date deliverable, because presumably that will block other lower priority work in due course. So we need a consistent way to do that. When is something actually ready for us to commit to? What pieces of information do we need as a team to confidently make the commitment to exercise that option and then see that through delivery? There's some criteria there that we should think about in terms of something being ready. Acceptance criteria, test cases, dependency analysis, whatever it may be, we need a consistent way to define things as ready. Otherwise, there's going to be more rework and more confusion. When is something blocked? We need consistent kind of heuristics around consistently blocking things. So the cool thing about blockers is, and Klaus Leopold will tell you all about this, but this gives us, we consistently block things and classify the sources common causes of delay in the system, then you get really insightful metrics around what are the biggest offenders in terms of causing systematic delay in our work. And then you go kind of chip away at those, and you can make some significant improvements. But we need a consistent way for teams to know when they need to block something in the system. Every time we block something in the system, I always see that as a great thing, because it gives us a little bit of insight into what's causing recurring delay in our system. Exit criteria, again, a high leverage type of policy for the workflow. The definition of done is okay, except it's horribly insufficient. Those are things that must be true at the end of the cycle, at the end of, when we deliver something. But we need definition of done for every state in the workflow to ensure that we're consistently doing things and that we're building integrity into the work. So exit criteria is actually really important. And so we, at BazaarVoice and in general, we like to spend a significant amount of time talking about these different types of policies. Dependencies are another important facet. Generally, we're trying to scale by not scaling, or we're trying to apply first principles at the team level and go around from team to team and make sure that the house is in order. But then we need to see what the dependencies are and understand that one team is a source of demand for another team. And so when we send demand to another team, that demand source needs to be a first-class citizen for that other team. And so we need to understand those interactions, and if we have SLEs or SLAs between the teams, but we need to understand what is in the critical path of delivering any given item, and then what dependent teams are hanging off the side. So we just need to understand those interactions and apply first principles at the level of the team to get a sense of that. And then the final exercise that in the workshops with BazaarVoice is a system design exercise, which again, low-tech, pen and paper, Sharpies and flip charts. Draw a picture based on all the prior exercises, what the problems and the workflow and the dependencies. Draw a picture of a system that you think you can move forward with. And let's try to lay in some WIP limits, some reasonable WIP limits on how much stuff we want to be working on at any given time. Let's think about allocating capacity for different types of, different classes of service on the side. Let's write the exit criteria on the bottom. There's no rocket science here. We just want to put something on paper that is coherent and is something that the team can move forward with. And so all the teams going through the workshop did this. And they sort of got a little kind of a rough draft of a blueprint of a system that they would move forward with. And then the teams had the option to either, you can start physical on the wall, or you can try to map it in. So that's kind of a contextual thing that the team decides. But you've got a lot of learning and a lot of archaeology that have been rolled into the system design activity. And generally, this is kind of it puts the team on reasonably strong footing going forward. Okay, and briefly, so train the trainer. Part of the scaling that we did was try to work with Kelly and Paul to enable them to be able to do the training and the coaching going forward. So those guys sat in several of the workshops and then started to co-facilitate aspects of it, and then just started doing it on their own. And so it's really cool. Now they're kind of doing all the training inside of BazaarVoice. So again, something that enabled the scaling aspect of it. So I mentioned scale-free scaling, which is really just the idea of we're not going to try to come up with a set of best practices and roll it out to all the teams, but we're going to work with each team individually, apply first principles, and just have a coherent system design, and then sort of evolve it going forward. At the end of the day, we scaled across about 250 folks, 28 teams, 5 functional areas, 4 geographies, and the book club was actually a cool thing that they added that I think is also helping to create an additional feedback loop so that people can get their questions answered, and I think it's been very successful. And with that, Paul will wrap.
Okay. Yeah, the book club was very useful. I had a relatively junior developer, DevOps actually, on one of our teams that had been through the foundation class that Eric conducted, or core class, and he was very frustrated because the team was doing Kanban, but they were still not like hitting any of their dates. They had huge WIP limit excess, so people were working on supposedly 4 or 5 things at a time, and he wasn't making any headway. So the book club really helped him to initially try different strategies, and then eventually it's like, hey, I need some help. And I was able to come in and help out, and the team's actually doing really well now. That was about 2 to 3 months ago, and he is their Kanban coach now. He's read the book forward, backwards, been through the foundation training, and that kind of stuff is very important. So I did want to talk about so I told that story about that first ops meeting. So that was something that I really never wanted to happen again. I mean, who wants to be stuck in a position like that? So what we saw. So I kind of highlighted this in a little bit of blue because you can't see the faded blue on the Jira board. If you use Jira, this is the runtime control chart. These are jumping up here, so there's spikes here and there's spikes here. So you can see the standard deviation is the blue, and it's quite wide. So we were completely unpredictable as a team. You can see the top number here is like 200 days. So it's quite large. We did our training back in July last year, or late June last year. And this is when we started making changes. And you can see as we're clearing out the system, how we're not really predictable still, but we're cleaning things up. And unfortunately, you can't see it here, but this curve is actually nice and narrow. So this is a very narrow curve where the wider it is, the more unpredictable it is. We were, within about a 5-day, I think it's about 5 to 7 days in width right here. So we had a very predictable lead time. And then you can see kind of our average with all of this garbage in here. We had like 6 weeks average lead time, which was, I thought, kind of high. As we started to get the workflow and the policies in place, I mean, the policies were remarkably powerful. I actually heard a developer say one time, well, without policies, this stuff doesn't work. It's like, yeah, I kind of agree. I mean, you should know when you're exiting a state and what you have to have. Some sort of checklist that says, code review is an example. In our very first training, I had what we call P4. So he is a right out of college developer. And we were talking about policies. And I had Rebecca Murphy, my tech lead, she's like, oh yeah, we got all these policies. This guy who's been here 6 months, out of school for 6 months, it's like, policies? We have policies? I don't know anything about policies. What are you talking about? And it's like, oh yeah, we actually have a code review policy, and we have checklists for that code review. So it was those policies, those workflows defining it has made us so much more predictable and increased our throughput to a point where all of a sudden we have slack time. Let's dig into that history and figure out what we need to close out, or what's valid, what's already, those bugs are already fixed, so we can move on. So that slack time was those policies and those workflow enabled the slack time to close out all that garbage. This here is probably the first time at BV we actually were closing more things than we were opening. And that was huge, because all of a sudden now you're burning through that backlog. And you can see this is incoming rate. So we're holding a steady incoming rate. We bounced off 0. I think, is that the next one? Yeah, so this is just showing how our age decreased. So here's about 4 weeks out from the end of October. And you can see our age here is 140 days on average, and it's just going straight down. A week after this, we bounced off 0 bugs. So we had 0 customer defects. And then now we can start focusing on all those 800 things that our product manager says is really cool that we should do, that it's going to take 5 years to ever do them. So let's get through those now that we have the time to do that. So that was huge. So now we have a coherent workflow. We've got policies that we can follow. We've got Sorry, I had brain freeze there. So we follow these policies, we follow the exit criteria, and all of a sudden, we're going really fast. We're going so fast that marketing says, hey, you need to slow down because we can't get our marketing material together fast enough for this. And program managers are like, we can't get our teams, our sales training, our support training, we can't get this done before you guys are releasing things. So we're still actually working through that. It's like, how do we release everything dark so that marketing we don't run into those sort of issues. It's definitely the beginning of a journey. We have lots of bumps that we're dealing with. I've had a number of times where I've heard teams say, oh, this Kanban thing's not working, and since I'm limited on time, I'll just say, in every case that we've had so far, it's something you stopped doing that was working. Well, don't stop doing it. It's okay to keep doing it. If you want to have those planning meetings and they're effective, then keep doing it. If you spend 6-8 hours estimating, probably not effective. So look at what you're doing and make sure it's effective. We argued with product management for probably close to 6 to 8 months about using Kanban in our roadmap planning. And through 3 different attempts, we finally came up with I know this is confusing, right? This is convoluted, but we actually came up with a process that when you execute on it, it's pretty effective. So we've used it to plan the past 2 quarters. The teams deliver 100% of their quarterly roadmap targets. All the features were delivered. None of them rolled over to the next quarter or anything like that. That's really important. And right now we're on track for our second quarter doing the same thing. So that was very huge, and it gained a lot of good feelings with the product teams. Now we have a little more leverage to say, hey, we need to spend more time on things like performance and scalability and stuff that's very techno-babble stuff, but not necessarily product-focused. So we have a lot more to do, but one of the really cool things is as we have been successful in R&D, we've had other organizations reach out to us for help. Legal, accounting, our client delivery, our support, our sales team. Most of these guys, I don't have a lot of experience in their business, and they're asking Kelly and I to help out doing some core training around Kanban, see how they can use it within their departments. So that was a quick, Eric and I, are happy to take questions now. I think we got about 5 minutes left, and I can answer about anything you ask probably. Go ahead.
Hi, what's some best practices you have for managing dependencies across the 28 different teams?
Yeah, so what we've done, because our teams are very interdependent, we have established a direct DRI, basically a directly responsible individual, who's basically for a feature is responsible to make sure all the coordination's occurring amongst the service teams, and that might be a stand-up. It might be a weekly meeting, just depends upon what they need in order to make sure they're getting all those dependencies clear. That picture that was really fuzzy that Eric showed on dependencies, that's like 40 or 50 steps of one team, and they are the most interdependent team at our company. And they have external vendors that they're dependent on, internal teams, and they're constantly managing those dependencies.
So how many product owners would you have that are supporting these teams? When you go through Kanban, you need to do, as you need it, design. How do you coordinate that with the people needed to actually do the design to help you work that out? Like in Scrum, you have a planned meeting. We can bring all those people together and have that design work and plan, how the acceptance criteria should be.
Sure.
In Kanban, you do that as needed.
Yeah.
How do you get the right people there as needed to do that?
Yeah, again, the DRI is the person that's primarily responsible for getting that together. Plus this particular process, part of that's actually a weekly, what you call a stand-up or status meeting. I don't know if you want to call it status because we want to try and keep it fairly short. So we talk about things like, what are blockers? Are there any blockers? Are there any dependencies on another team that may not have a product owner or something like that, or product manager? But the DRI is the one that's primarily responsible working with the product owners as well as the cross teams. Does that answer your question?
Okay, so you don't actually bring those 10 people into those meetings as needed. You're depending on the business analyst basically to gather that information and have it ready for the meeting.
Well, it's actually the dev managers and product owners work together to do that. And if there's a user experience dependency, then we get a user experience designer involved. So yeah, I mean, some features you don't need that. You just know what you need to do from an engineering standpoint. But we definitely rely on the DRI and the individual engineers to raise up, hey, I need more information, or we need to meet to talk about the dependencies.
Can you talk a little bit about the logistics of the scaling up of the team? So I felt like I heard maybe your initial consultant and 2 managers trained. So was it just 3 of you that trained the teams? Did you kind of go one at a time? Did you go in parallel, overlapping? Give us a little bit of insight.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank
you. As the initial dev manager, I will admit I was very selfish. I wanted my team to go first. And so I did have my teams involved, and then Kelly got involved. He's kind of our process guy, right? So he makes sure that processes are happening across the organization. So he's actually the one that came up with the plan of making sure all the teams were planned or scheduled to get trained. And Gary Allison, our EVP, so the one thing he did mandate is that everybody had to go through the training. So he didn't mandate you had to do what's trained, but he did mandate you had to go through the training. So we did that initial training with the display team, and then I think roughly a month later, we did another 2 teams, and we did roughly 2 a month. And I think it was about 3 months or 4 months before we felt comfortable enough to Kelly and I started running the training with the teams. So I don't know, that's really quick. I'm happy to talk more about it with you afterwards if you want. Yes?
Yeah, we're interested about the dependencies between the teams and where one team would be a source of demand for another. It gets into sort of upstream Kanban and things like that.
Yeah.
Did you actually have cases where you'd take a ticket from one board and run it over to another board, or you'd have a infinite queue that would represent, oh, that's the next team over? I'm just curious how you did
We actually
that.
have done it a lot of different ways, depending upon the context. So I actually have a team where we have a handoff from dev to QA, and there is a infinite queue, essentially, or there's a queue between the 2, and as dev finishes up, and that was by their choice. They asked for that. And then sometimes we'll have it where, okay, I need something done by the configuration team, so we'll put a ticket in their system, link them, and then it's essentially blocked or waiting until that other ticket gets cleaned up. So different teams definitely do it differently. So they all work. It's just a matter of whether you're exposing the work. So she said 0 minutes left. One question? Okay.
Sorry to hold you all late. So I definitely see the value in having each team, kind of emerge their own process. But it does seem a bit disorienting at a high level. Like, do you still have some way to bubble this up and to make sense of this at a portfolio level or kind of across all of the various teams and what the status of the entire product is?
Yes, we do. And unfortunately, I can't show that to you because that's got future roadmap items in it. So, but yeah, we basically, the tickets roll up to what I would call just kind of like a bar. And then if there's blocks, one of the tickets blocked, the color of the bar changes. So, and then that weekly meeting, we discuss it. And then if something big happens, we'll talk about it before the meeting. But generally, that's when we catch up about things like that. So, but yeah, we basically kind of, I don't want to say gave up, but we decided to just do our own thing for now until we can find one of these tools that does a better job of it. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.